This podcast was sponsored by and recorded at Crossings Pub and Eatery on Hyde Park.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you may be with us. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicars Crossing here from Crossings Pub and Eatery on Hyde Park Road in London, Ontario. My name is Rob Henderson, and I'm the rector and priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
Fret not, he's not alone. He's here with me, Kevin George, rector of St. Aidan's Anglican Church in Northwest London, Ontario. And we're not alone.
We're not alone.
Yeah, I'm also here. I am Iain, and I run the sound for this podcast.
Producer Iain. Producer Iain is a cool cat.
He is a cool cat, our techno wizard.
Techno wizard, generally well-spoken young man.
Very much so.
Very talented musically. Wrote the music that you heard as you were coming into this podcast.
You guys flatter me.
Well, he has a very good taste in soda pop beverages.
He loves that.
Because the Dad's root beer is my favorite.
Okay.
And whenever I'm going to have a root beer.
That's it. It's
the
Dad's.
Dad's.
All right.
So Iain, top notch.
Good job, buddy.
Good choice today, buddy.
We were to have with us today Najwa Zebian, and I got an email from her people yesterday to our people, who is me. And
yeah, we don't have people, folks.
We don't have any handlers.
No.
But Najwa, she's got some handlers, so they got a hold of me yesterday, or to the people who handle us, and that's me. And one of the things that Najwa has been busy doing is audio recordings of her 3 books, her 2 that are out in her upcoming book. And because of that, and she just had a recent performance on Saturday night that Rob and I were at.
Right.
And her voice has taken a little bit of a battering, and she's been advised to give it a rest for a week. So
and we concurred.
We did.
No fun doing a podcast when you can't speak.
No, it's very boring
for the listener. It's quite boring.
It's very bad.
It's hard for the interviewers.
Now, I will
it's worse
say,
for the listeners.
I will say, we were at Talbot Street Church on Saturday evening for Najwa's presentation of some of her poetry or story, along with London Sinfonia's music, and it was a beautiful night of music and poetry.
It was
augmented and made even more exciting.
We had a special guest that night, which was not invited.
Not invited.
And I was really looking forward to asking her about that, so I'm going to save it.
We got to keep it till next week.
We'll tease it a little bit.
There was an uninvited guest,
yeah,
and it was hard to ignore the uninvited guest. So I'll leave it at that.
Right. We'll leave it at that, and we'll expand that a little bit next week.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think we should have a segment on this program. This is for the listeners out there. So today what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation today about a number of things about church, missional church, things that we face as after we sort of check in a little bit here about what we've got going on in our communities if you happen to be in the London area. But the one thing we wanted to tease out was whether or not you listeners might email into us at vicarscrossing@gmail.com or tweet us or Facebook us your questions to us, sure. But we're going to have a segment we'd like to have every single podcast called AIA. AIA, which would be what, Rob?
Ask Iain anything.
Ask producer Iain anything. Are you good with that, Iain?
Sure, yeah, I'm fine with that.
Because we got to the point where we really don't know much, Kevin and I.
No.
We're just the talking heads.
That's it.
Iain's the brains behind all this. So we want Iain to take the questions and bring them forward and bring them onto the show.
Yep.
And we'll throw our 2 cents in and go from there.
Yeah, that's right.
Fair enough?
So,
Sure.
So the first question really comes to Iain today. This is a question for Iain from a listener who asked this question, wondered if I'd pass it on.
Okay.
Today is as good a day for us to get this going and then invite it. So you ready for this, Iain?
I got to be warmed up. I'm ready. Let's go.
Yeah,
Here we go.
All right. So the first question that was asked, someone asked me to ask Iain why such a talented and clearly creative young man would endeavor to take time on a nearly weekly basis to hang out with 2 middle-aged priests and who are less talented than yourself, say, maybe not as creative. And the question really is what motivates Iain to do something like that?
Huh. Okay.
It ain't money, I can tell you that. We're not paying.
How's the pay?
I have a few angles towards this, and it's not like I'm being like, oh yeah, it's all for like status or whatever. No, I actually
Well, no,
have
I mean
fun.
the status is incredible on this.
Yeah.
No,
yeah,
I have a lot of fun doing this. One of the things was there was like a painter like Picasso or something like that. I don't remember exactly who it was, but what he did is he took up like a job at like a bank that was like pointless. And I'm not saying this podcast is pointless.
Are you suggesting this is
no,
pointless?
no. Like it was like a scientist or whatever, and they had their major breakthrough at that bank.
Right.
And what I'm really getting at is that inspiration can come from anywhere.
Right.
And like I want to be someone who produces creative material. So I want to be inspired as many ways as possible. And this is like a great way to have sort of conversations that you wouldn't normally have on a regular basis as someone who is my age. So
no, that's good. Good for you. I mean, how many times have we been offered to do something or asked to do something in our lives, and we went, well, that has nothing to do with me, or that's not my thing, but maybe looking back saying, well, that was a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And that's it, to be brave enough to step into something that might be a little bit different from what you usually do and say, let's see what I can get out of it.
And you and I probably know that there are those things that we've done over the years that weren't really, we didn't think they would take us to where we are now.
No,
right?
not at all.
To
Not
the
at all.
high and lofty place of being
That's
a priest
right,
in a
yeah,
parish.
That's right.
I'm
That's right.
saying that with a big smile on my face,
Yep,
folks.
yep.
But nonetheless, I love what I do, and I know you love what you do.
Very much so,
But
yeah.
but I didn't, I had to do a bunch of jobs that didn't look like this, and at times I volunteered to do lots of things over the years that you wouldn't have necessarily guessed I'd go volunteer to do, but something in there opened a door to a larger piece of myself.
Yeah, and also like, sorry.
Go ahead, Iain. Yeah.
But I'm also here to like help out Kevin, right? And usually when Kevin asks me to do something, I'm like, if it doesn't interfere with what I have already planned, I'm down to do it.
Wow,
yeah.
I got to think of some more things that are beneficial.
That's dangerous too.
Yeah,
Kevin
well-
can ask us to do some interesting things.
Not to
Once you get
tease,
to
but
know
there's a
him,
big
yeah,
announcement
yeah,
coming
yeah,
up
okay,
sometime this
well,
year,
we'll
folks, but we're not
get
letting it
into
out of
that
the bag
yeah,
yet.
That's later. That's later. But no, I remember being. You're right. Sometimes things happen in places that you never would have expected, but you look back on it and say, "Well, that was the complete turning point."
Yeah.
And for me, it was I was 14 years old, lost soul, right, hanging out with the wrong crowd, and
Yeah.
I was going through some stuff at that age, and my grandmother was in the hospital, and I went up to visit her, and it was a lifelong Anglican and churchgoer, and I'd been, of course, here and there, and she pulled out of her purse an advertisement cut out of the Huron Church News, which is, for those outside of our little world, the Anglican newspaper, and it was an advertisement for Huron Church Camp. 2 weeks to come up, and they'd give you free room and board, and you could go up and work for a couple of weeks. And she handed it to me, and this was in the winter, like around now, February or March. And I didn't have anything to do that summer, and so I went for 2 weeks. Ended up staying for 4 because I loved it. Ended up staying 5 or 6 years after that. And then it started to lead me down a path toward being part of a faith community and a church community.
That's what camp
But in a
does for you.
moment,
Sorry.
that's what it did for me, for sure. But in that moment, in that hospital room,
Yeah.
I didn't even want to go to the hospital room. Who wants to go up and see their grandmother?
They're
at
in the
14?
hospital, right?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't-
Interesting, and
yeah,
she's lying
yeah.
in a hospital bed, and she's ministering to you in a way.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you hang out at a church camp, or it is a church camp, yeah? Camp Kamoki, is it?
Yeah, Camp Kimuki. It's funded by the United Church.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wouldn't call it a church camp, which is probably something I shouldn't say, but
Very controversial,
Too late.
folks. Send your letters to Iain. Tweet Iain of Destiny on Twitter.
We are definitely like a spiritual camp. Like
Yeah,
there's
sure,
definitely something that's going on there that I wouldn't really call something that's a religion, but it's the bonding between different people, and it's just honestly like a great place to be.
Yeah. Well, I never thought at the time I was in church or I was in
That's the thing
faith
about
formation or
Yeah.
being formed in a faithful or
Yeah.
spiritual way at all. I had no idea.
I was afraid
just
to
with
leave.
people that I loved.
I was afraid
Yeah,
to leave my mother long enough to go to camp. Let's just be honest.
No, but camp is an amazing place, and
It was,
and
yeah. It is I know a lot of people have stories like that go to those places. But anyway.
But I think about too, like as you were just talking about that, what came to mind is our dear family priest when I was a kid, Reverend Morley Butcher, came to the church. He was a very quiet and sort of non-threatening presence in our community. He was in his last pastorate. He stayed with us for about 7 or 8 years before he retired. And I was a kid who was really troubled, not because I was hanging with the wrong crowd, but because I was badly bullied and abused really in school. And I used to be fearful to go and couldn't wait to get off the bus in the afternoons. There were a lot of beatings and a lot of tears, and I never talked about it a lot. My mother knew about it, and father, I guess, and my closest friends, and everybody who kicked the crap out of me knew about it. But I mean, it wasn't something I talked about at church or anything like that. I went because my mom went, but somehow or another, it was like Morley Butcher knew that I needed something,
Right.
and he and I never talked about my troubles, but somehow or another he knew. And I remember the day he came to my house. And I was maybe just not much younger, a little bit younger than Iain, probably by about 3 years or so. And he came in and he sat down and he said, "Kevin, I'm wondering if you could do something for me at church." And I said, "Well, what is that?" And he said, "Well, I'd like for you to become a server." And I said, "What is that?
What?
I've never heard of such a thing." And, we grew up in a church that could fit in this room here, in this bar, in this pub. It might have seated 40 people jam-packed, maybe 50. I don't know. It was a very tiny space. I'd never seen anybody but the priest in robes, so I had no idea what it was. Yeah. So he explained to me what it was, and he had me go down to the old one-room schoolhouse that was there that had been turned into our little parish hall. That was the old Anglican school. Okay. And go over and get a chair, and I brought it over, and it barely fit between the communion rail and the altar. That's how small this place was. And he went and brought me a robe from one of the other 4 churches in the place, and he set me up in it and taught me how to serve. And I began serving. And that became a lifesaver. And at first, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know why I would do it, but I really respected Morley Butcher. Yeah. And so if he asked me to do something, just like Iain is talking about, I was sort of go, "Well, yeah, if you want me to do that, I'll do it." And man, was I ever nervous when I started. And then I remember the first time he asked me to read was Christmas Eve. Oh. And the place was full. There had to be like 28 people there.
I was going to say, they're packed in our
It was jam, man. And most of them were my family. Yeah. And but I literally felt my knees knocking together, right? Like I shook so much doing that reading. Yeah. And but that was the place where I all of a sudden knew that I belonged. It became a very safe place for me. Right. I had all kinds of places where I felt threatened. I had the sanctity and safety of my home because I had a good family and a strong bond with my family. And I now had this thing in church, and Morley Butcher then got me off to conferences that were for youth, and where I met a whole new circle of friends that weren't threatened by me or whatever, and I didn't have any of the problems I had at school. So, those sorts of opportunities to include people and bring them in are massive. So, Iain, you have to look forward to a life as a priest.
That's right. We'll help you along. Don't worry.
No, we'll spare you.
But that's it. I mean, and the word you hit on was belonging. And in your situation and in my situation and Iain's, I think, at camp too, you felt you belonged, right? Mm-hmm. And all the other stuff was secondary.
That's right.
But it came along and you started to find things that you were interested in a faith life that really tweaked your interest. But the first thing is about belonging, which, really points to when we talk about engaging the church in the public square. Yeah. That very well may be the bottom line of it all and the crux of it all, is how do we make things accessible for people so their first experience is belonging. That's right. Because church has got to be different than the world. Yeah. It's like you're in the world, but you're not of the world. And the world does a really good job and works real hard at telling people that they don't belong and they need to fix themselves and there's something wrong with them.
And there's some way for them to individually do all that.
Yeah, exactly. And don't worry about anything bigger than yourself because you can do it. Yeah. But even as you're trying to do it, the world's back at you saying, well, you're not quite doing it.
Not quite there yet.
Yeah.
If you just buy one more thing.
One more car, one more house, one more stock and bond, you'll be fine. But that sense of belonging at a very root level is just huge. And I think sometimes we forget that. Yep. So it's an important thing to think about.
Well, that would have been mid-'80s, okay, I'm talking about. So that's ancient days to you, Iain. Mm-hmm. But you know what? Morley Butcher never asked me that day. He never asked me what I believed. Yeah. He never said, now, before I ask you to do this, I need to know, how do you feel about the Trinity?
That's true.
What do you believe the basic fundamental theology of your baptism is? Do you believe in a virgin birth, Kevin? How do you feel about the resurrection? Is it a bodily resurrection or a spiritual one? Yeah. There were none of those questions. Yeah. And this was, like I said, this was a long time ago. And for me, I think one of the challenges we have as an institution today is getting to that place where we are able to communicate to the public as we live and try to breathe as a church to be a part of the public discourse, is to communicate to the broader public that we're not wrapped up in making sure you believe everything right before you get to the church door and cross that threshold. You know, I was just on, I do a radio broadcast locally here on Thursdays, and this morning they were asking me about the so-called street preachers here in London.
Oh, yeah.
For those who are outside of our listening area, there's a couple of men who spend a lot of their time on the street corner here in downtown London, generally berating women about short hair or tight clothes or wearing dresses, that they're going to hell. They tend to spend a lot of time telling people about right belief, and in a very judgmental and angry way. And unfortunately, for many people who have very little experience of the church, they see people like these two and they think that that is reflective of what they will find if they show up at their local parish community or church on Sunday morning, where I believe that it's really nothing could be further from the truth. There's a very small fraction of Christianity in terms of the institutional church that is that judgmental and rigid, and so on. Now, to a degree, we all got a lot of work to do to get off of this right belief, to learn how to love and be people of behavior, you know.
Yeah, we want to give mental assent to everything before we
once you've got all the boxes ticked off,
then you're okay. And and
you
again,
you didn't have to get that figured out before you went to church camp. Did you?
not at all, not at all. And again, it goes back to this idea of belonging. That belonging is not something that is based around what we think, believe, or get right. Belonging for me was suddenly realizing that I could be part of this, even though I didn't know.
Right.
But I had other people to ask questions of and share thoughts with and enter into the same mysteries as everybody else.
Right.
And then I also started to learn as I got a bit older that the people I was with were as messed up as I was.
Yeah.
And, and what a great sense of belonging that is.
Yes.
I remember having a conversation once with a young man once who said, I could never go into church because I've done so many things and I messed up, and I said, well, then you'd fit in quite well. Yeah. Because there's
Join
really
the rest of us.
Yeah, there's nobody in the pews that are not, and that's a sense of belonging that's at a very deep level. Yeah. That we need to be conscious of.
I think it's huge. You and I have been talking about some of the books that we've looked at and that our communities use or are going to use in book study context, and one that we did here recently, I referenced in the last podcast, was a Brian McLaren book, which is called The Great Spiritual Migration.
Right.
And in that book, he makes a pretty strong case for really what we're talking about here, that our communities that are held back tend to be most held back when we get too bogged down in making sure when people come in the door that they believe the right things, or that they accept the proper belief of the church. Where the first thing you might find on a web page is some talk about here's our statement of belief.
Yes, right.
And I found it interesting that in his book, I'll just read a piece of this, which was interesting to me. He's talking about a church called East Lake Community in Bothell, Washington. And he really holds them up as an example of a place that's willing to communicate to the wider public that they don't have all the answers,
right? And
that this is a good place to come if you feel that way too. And so their webpage, this is how they describe themselves on their webpage. It's probably important to start, they write, by making it clear that we're not the ones who finally got the Bible right. Neither do we possess the secret to life, exclusive access to God, or 7 steps to satisfaction. We are, however, powerfully drawn to the person of Jesus, his teaching, and even more so his life. So we are experimenting and failing and building a community that collectively follows his ways, hoping, trusting, and even doubting that it might seed something beautiful in the world, namely, full and abundant life for all of creation. We think the truth about life may just be love, and love may just be the way. And he goes on to say that if they find that honesty and humility attractive when they see it, they can search a little deeper and they'll find a page called What We Aspire to Believe instead of a list of doctrinal
What
statements.
we actually believe.
This is what they write. We think the world is tired of religious people who claim to believe a list of ideas when those very ideas don't translate into any kind of personal transformation. Plus, we see belief as a dynamic lived out in reality, which doesn't translate well into a few paragraphs on a website.
Yeah.
I thought that was
Yeah,
just
it's brilliant. Yeah, it's wonderful. The word that jumped out to me was experimenting.
Right.
You know,
The willingness to try.
Yeah, and be brave enough and dare enough to try new things and do new things and speak differently and think differently and
Right.
and try on different things and see
Yeah.
how they fit and
Yeah.
And not to the point of getting to some final destination per se or final understanding that we can
Right.
wrap it all up with a nice bow on it,
Exactly.
but to go through the process of experimenting together
Yeah.
and in a very loving, playful, joyous way, because
Right.
if we're not getting joy out of it, then we got to rethink what we're doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing that struck me is one book that I'm looking at doing is to follow up on that one is a book by Alan Roxburgh called "Joining God in Remaking the Church and Changing the Ways of the World." Its subtitle is even longer than that, so I won't say it. But basic premise of his book is that really we're called to be a people who get out of where we are and get out into the world. The book, he says, is proposed that the great unraveling of the Euro-tribal churches over the last 50 or more years has actually been none other than the work of the Holy Spirit. That this sort of unraveling that we see around us is not something that we should be, frantic about in terms of having to fix everything or put it back where it all belonged. But that instead we ought to sort of embrace what the Holy Spirit may be doing and actually go look for where God is already at work in the neighborhood.
Right.
He uses, I just came from knitting, boys.
Yeah,
Knitting.
you mentioned
Yeah.
that about before.
Right.
It's a
so-
lovely sweater, by the way.
Thank you very much. I didn't knit this one today.
Oh, okay.
However, it was knit for me by a great lady named Pam Black down in Windsor and multicolored.
You'll get if you aspire to that.
Well, right?
That's looking good.
It's a good angle. Yeah.
Alan Roxburgh uses his wife's knitting as an analogy in this book that I just referenced. And he says that he got quite frustrated one night because he saw his wife had a sweater almost like over half knit.
Yeah.
And then she all of a sudden noticed some flaw, or she didn't like the way it was or something like that. I can't remember the details now, but she unravels the whole thing. Like she just unravels all this knitting he's seen her do for hours and hours. And it's like, oh my goodness, she's unraveling this shirt. What's going to happen now? She's unraveling this knitting, this sweater. And it was at that moment that he had this revelation that maybe, just maybe, all this stuff that's happening, as he calls them, the Euro-tribal church that we've all lived in here, that's been influenced by sort of Eurocentric attitudes, that the unraveling that's taken place in the last 50 years in church decline and so on is not something that we should be lamenting as much as we should be coming to understand that may very well be the work of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And that God's work is already on the go out there. And instead of trying to knit back what we thought was right 50 years ago, we ought to be busy getting out there and taking on the work that God has already begun. And so he lists off and it really got me thinking. He writes about, he says, eventually church growth, because that's what we seem to, I don't remember my adult life, been involved in church most of my life. And what I remember is there's always been another program to try and fix the church, right?
Oh,
so
there's probably a lot lined up.
Right. So
ready
he writes about this, about the 70s and 80s and about all the programs that came along. And then he gets on to talking about the corporate approach that came along, about strategic planning. Boy, have we ever heard enough about that, right? And you got to have a 5-year plan and get your mission and ministry plan together and all that. All good stuff, mind you. But it's always directed at somehow or another it's going to be the next thing. And he writes that eventually church growth morphed into a different metaphor, borrowed from the growing popularity of the health movement. The basic idea for the church health movement was to discover indicators of health of a congregation. Now, see if any of our listeners or you, Rob, remember some of these places. A dominant player in the church health was natural church development.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right? That one's which uses a survey to measure a congregation's health.
NCD.
Yes, measure their health in 8 areas: empowering leadership, gift-oriented ministry, passionate spirituality, functional structures, inspiring worship, holistic small groups, need-oriented evangelism, and loving relationships. Loving relationships.
And what we did was put them on a big whiteboard.
Yes.
And with a box next to it.
Yep.
And said, we're going to make ourselves this in
Yeah.
the next 6 months. And we'll check that off. What's next?
Right. And we'll put
Right.
that binder
Yeah.
on the shelf, and then
We'll
we'll
put
go
on
do
the
some.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, he talks about how they went through all of this and emerging church and, all the different manifestations, and even missional church to a degree. And he's one of the missional church writers. And he says his newest revelation is that all of these things are an attempt to recapture the good old days.
Yeah.
Which is the same sickness that's driving America right now around Make America Great Again, as if there was there's some panacea that will take us to this place where everything is great.
Well, it was perfect 30 years ago. Right?
Yeah,
There
right.
were never any
Right.
problems 30 years
Right.
ago.
But the truth of the matter is that I'm old enough to remember 30 years ago, and I was going door to door as a teenager for something called Anglicans in Mission.
Yeah.
All right? I was a kid
Yeah.
going door to door. And as a teenager going, well, have you made your pledge, and what are you going to do, and blah blah blah. But what he says now is, if we leave our buildings and leave our systematic ways of worrying about whether people believe the proper belief when they come and so on, and we go out into our neighborhoods and we go to those places where people are doing incredible work, and we partner with organizations where things are happening, we might come to find that God is already at work, and we can join God in that work instead of waiting for people to come to us. He makes the point that Jesus nowhere in the scripture says, set up a plan and get a strategy together and they will come.
Yeah.
He talks about going. And so really, I think that these new initiatives that he's talking about is really trying to get us to a place where we can get outside of ourselves and think really, as McLaren puts it, think in ways that might be born out of how we might work and live and move and have our being together, how we might belong together, to use the word you used earlier, in community. And then sometimes belief is something that's strongly built after that. Sometimes people come to us not knowing what they believe.
Right. And again, it's not a place to get to.
No.
Once I get everything in order and I
Yeah.
believe everything, I'll finally understand it all, and then I can feel a little bit better about the whole thing. But that's never the goal at the end of the day. And you talk about the unraveling when you were talking about that with the sweater and the threads and things like that. I was thinking that one of the gifts of the Spirit doing that unraveling is that it's causing us as communities and individuals to become a lot more creative, to look at all that unraveling mess and say, what's in there?
Right.
Because all the components are there. It's kind of like the metaphor I've used before of my grandmother used to crochet, right? And I used to go into her apartment, and she'd have 3 or 4 things she was working on, and they'd be leaning against the couch, but you could only see the back, right? So all you'd see from the back were all these different colors of threads hanging down, and it was a mess. But my brother and I would go in, and we would try to guess what she was knitting, and by the shapes and the colors, and it would force us to be somewhat imaginative. And then the game was, of course, you'd turn it around, you could see, oh, she's doing a cardinal or a tree or something like that. But what I learned from that, and remember from that, is just as you were talking about, when it looks like a mess, instead of getting ourselves all wrapped up in the fact that it's falling apart or unraveling, the other option is to look at and be creative about what is perhaps there that we're not seeing in the perfection that we were trying to get to, and be creative and see opportunity within that mess.
Right.
And isn't that where Jesus went all the time? Didn't Jesus always go into the mess?
Yes.
He never turned away from the mess and said, "Oh, well, look at that guy over there. He's not all together, guys. We best not be going over talking to him." No, it was complete opposite.
Right.
And again, that's where the transformation takes place, and the opportunity to create newness.
Roxburgh talks about it in this book. He says that basic principle is, once we've accepted the fact that the unraveling might actually be not a bad thing, that we don't have to get back to someplace. He sums up what you're talking about there really in a process of saying that practicing the journey then becomes about listening, right? Like really listening to what's going on in the community and hearing what people are saying, because people need to. And he uses some scriptural references around that. Like one of them, he talks about Lazarus, how tightly bound Lazarus is in Scripture, and how he needs to be unwound and let go.
Let go.
Right? And that requires, really listening for what the pain was in that situation from the sisters and so on. But he says it's listening, it's discerning, and then it's testing and experimenting. To go back to what McLaren was talking about on that webpage of that Bothell Church, is they say we're experimenting, right?
Yeah.
Testing and experimenting, then reflecting, and then deciding. So is this productive? Is this bringing us closer to transformation? Is this bringing us closer
And
to?
you can't do that if you think you've got all figured out.
No, and you can't do that if you're not prepared to take a risk and do something that might
exactly. fail. Yeah, and it could fail. It could not work well.
Yeah,
but that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
That's the journey. That's what we're doing.
What about you, Ian? Do you have a question for us?
Oh, I just got to stretch first.
He's just got to stretch it out. We may have lost Ian for a while, folks. Stay tuned. He's coming around.
He's coming back. just another
rebooting a
sip
little
of that
bit.
Dad's root beer. You'll be ready to go.
Yeah.
It's very strange hearing you guys talk about the church from inside the church. I find that really interesting. The fact that you guys are still subjective,
Yeah.
sure, about what you're doing, and yet you still do it. Like, you can be like, this could be wrong, or this could be right, but I'm still going to do it because it's something that I know, or whatever. Yeah.
But that's what I love about it. Like, the thing is, when you've experienced belonging, deep relationships, the knowing what it's like to celebrate with people, but also mourn with people in a very deep way. When the church is at its best, you see the potential of what it can be.
Right.
So, people ask me, and sometimes I even ask myself, why do I keep doing what I'm doing? It's because I've seen the big picture, and you can see what it can be. And I see the faces of parishioners and people that come into our parishes and into our communities. Even there's a once a year at Christmas. And the reminder to me is all of us are seeking that.
Right. Yeah, and you found your calling. That's that's a big part of it as well. Obviously, you feel like you're. It's a natural progression. It's where God's calling you to be. Mm-hmm. So I don't question that. But there are some things like in any vocation where you sometimes bash your head against the wall and say, "Why am I doing what I'm doing, and why am I keep going through all this?" Because sometimes it is difficult. Mm-hmm. But you keep the big picture in mind. And again, that big picture to me has always been God's got a dream for God's world.
Yep.
We see it in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And when you have that image in your mind and you see what that dream can be, you want to participate in it.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it'll be like when I'm done and how it's all going to look, but I'd rather participate in it than stand on the sidelines.
That's right. Yeah. And for me, Rob, I want to participate in it, and I want to open it up to others to participate in too, right?
Yes.
And so, like, we've been having a great discussion this past few weeks at St. Aidan's about what we're calling Bridget's Banquet. I think I mentioned last week. So Bridget's Banquet is going to be a dinner church on a Sunday night, and it's really an invitation to those who are afraid to cross that threshold because they don't know what they're going to find,
right? And
they feel that they got to know all the right beliefs and so on. In fact, Iain has agreed to come and share some of his music at our first one, March the 3rd.
Yeah, I remember saying that.
Yeah, you did. And
I'll be there.
And but the idea is, and we've had to do some work with some of our parishioners because they don't know how they feel about getting into a reality or supporting a reality where church is not the way they're used to it. Right. And I had to make an announcement on Sunday explaining to people, this is not a dinner the church is hosting for people to come to.
Right.
Yeah. This is not where we're going to be the host and some people are going to be our guest, because this particular banquet is one where everybody shows up, signs up to take a role. Every person who comes is going to have a role in making, setting, cleaning. It's a community.
Yeah.
And so it is true to the earliest church in a way, in terms of people gathering and sharing a meal together. And it's really a place where we want there to be no holes barred, so to speak, in terms of people being free to talk.
It reminds me of that one ad. I don't really like talking about ads, but this one's all right. I believe.
But if you'd like to sponsor the Vicars Crossing, please email us at vicarscrossing@gmail.com.
Anyway, I believe it was a PC ad. Anyway, like President's
Choice?
Not as in like
Doug Ford?
Yeah.
Not a Doug
anyway,
Ford ad,
it was about how we've grown up all eating together.
Yes.
And then when we sort of get into a desk job, quote unquote, you eat by yourself. And it's like that sense of sort of belonging also comes with good meal around you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and that I was actually, we're looking at that during the Super Bowl. Actually, it came to mind. I saw
Yeah.
this, and I thought, but what's been interesting to me is that, and what gives me hope that this thing is actually going to be useful, is that it's been hard for some people to get their head wrapped around,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so that gives me hope.
That's the unraveling, isn't it?
Right.
And that's being able to say,
Yeah.
we don't know what this looks like,
Right.
but that's okay.
And
I'm
and this
okay
is
with
very
that.
unpredictable for
Yeah,
us.
we
right?
don't know what's gonna happen.
We don't know who's coming in the door. We
Yeah.
don't know what they're going to say.
Yeah.
We don't know how the meal is going to turn out because we're
Right.
going to do it together. All of those things are unknowns. But what we know is it's a bunch of followers of Jesus on the way. So that makes it Christ-centered right there if we didn't do anything else. We're very focused on breaking bread together and sharing wine together and remembering the Lord's Supper and doing that as an act with a full dinner in the midst of it. And we're going to invite people like Iain to share his art, which is not particularly religious. But I heard Iain sing a piece of music, which I've invited him to sing at this. I heard him sing it. You heard him sing it at our Patronal Festival.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He
back
sang
in
a piece
in
that
the
he
fall.
wrote himself, and it was born out of his experience. Bless you. It was born out of his experience of visiting and another land, and he had a deeply powerful experience of that. And then he wrote a piece of music about it.
Good.
Mhm,
Do you
yes, I
feel
did.
comfortable sharing that in any way at all? Or?
Sure. Okay. So that's my end goal, is to be writing songs and writing music, and I want to like boost the Canadian music scene. But this song that was a tangent, but this song is
The
about
new Drake, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, you heard him here on the Vicars Crossing before you got to see him on whatever TV show he'll be on, and then later his solo career.
Yeah. Anyway.
Remember, AIA, ask Iain anything.
Yeah. So I wrote this song after a trip to Wales. It's a sticker on my computer I went there with my two brothers and my two grandparents, and I went over there for my 15th birthday, around then. And we walked along the shoreline, and to one side was like this open sea, and then to the other side was these massive cliffs. And I remember just thoroughly enjoying every step, even though like it was rocky on the ground and the wind was fairly cold. The whole experience there was just, it was something that I couldn't put into words.
Right.
And I still can't. It's not something that I could just write down. And perhaps for me, writing a song about being there and wanting to take someone there for them to experience it is a way that I can sort of express my awe in what I saw. So that's that.
It was pretty cool. And I think I told you one day,
Yeah.
I said, that the Celts had a way, and it was very interesting that you were in the land of the Celts when you had this, what we call numinous experience. But what Iain experienced is what the Celts called a thin place.
Thin places. Yeah.
That you're in this space where what you feel separates you from that which is ever bigger than you, whatever language you use to describe God or the larger presence. And no amount of sort of human knowing
Right.
can describe that.
Yeah, and like talking about that, it's also super interesting because it's not like it's a ray of sun coming in and like a massive
it's
cloud
nothing like
hand.
that.
It's like it was kind of a
It was
crummy
an
day.
Ordinary.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of my favorite authors and scholars, Marcus Borg,
Yeah.
talked about thin places a lot, and he always defined it as where the temporal or the earthly
Yeah.
meets the
Meets
spiritual,
the spiritual.
and that's that thin space, and you enter into it. So you're kind of in between.
And just
Yeah.
like the psalmist, who so long ago tried to put to words and sort of hymnody or psalmody their feelings, their human feelings. I had said to Iain, listening to that piece of music very much reminded me of a psalm and of an outpouring of a beautiful experience. It was like one of the psalms of ascent, one of the sort of celebratory songs.
Yeah.
And so because it's to me a deeply spiritual piece of music, that is something that I want him to offer that night when people come from places where they don't use the same language and terminology that we use around the church. We were tossing some of that around earlier, Ian. You were probably fascinated by some of our church terminology.
Yeah, actually, I want to touch on something before we talk about your special language. I didn't.
Well, are we speaking about my Newfoundland accent? Or?
No, like what I find super interesting about the song that I wrote is that I didn't write it with the intention of being super spiritual, but like the fact that people can draw that from any kind of music, I think is super interesting. Anyway, going on about your language, while we were setting up, Rob and Kevin were discussing some sort of alien words about the in-depth things in the church, and go on.
Well, what we were talking about was
We're
getting ready to
kibitzing
talk
in church
about
language.
what we were going to talk about today, and this idea of oftentimes when we want people to come in to belong, as we were talking about, we put up these barriers right away because the church has some special words and language that they use, which is really insider
talk.
code.
Yep.
And if you don't know what it is,
Yeah.
then the first thing that can happen when you walk through the doors is that you feel excluded.
That's right.
Right?
I'm not an insider. I don't even know what these words are.
Right. And like one example was, because I overheard it in somebody coming into the entranceway, and they were new, and they asked where the washrooms were or something, and the person at the door said, yeah, they're just down to the left, just go through the narthex and past the sacristy, and it's over to the left there.
Right. Sounds, you expect...
And they looked at her and said, what are you talking about?
Yeah, you,
know,
you
it's that
expect
kind of stuff.
something from the Lord of the Rings to come out.
That's
you know?
right.
That's right. It's like, where's the rector? Well, he's up in the vestry putting on his chasuble.
Yes.
I see he's putting his mantle on right now. He's getting very
mantle,
close. Yeah,
Some sort of wizardry thing.
Yeah,
in his office ironing his
Gandalf
mantle.
will be here in a moment. And, we have, and it's much simpler than that. And we don't realize we're doing it, and it's not ill-intended.
No, not at all.
But what I'm getting at, I suppose, is in terms of, and this is where we're hoping something like our Bridges Banquet can open church to a new bunch of people, because we don't have to talk like that in that setting.
Right.
But it's sometimes things that are so familiar to us in church land that we forget that people outside of it have never heard it.
Right.
We talk about hymnals and BASs in the Anglican Church of Canada, the Book of Alternative Services. BAS wasn't bass. What is this?
Are we
bass?
fishing?
Bulletins and BASs and hymns and hymnals and we tell people to stand here, kneel there, sit there, move all about and do the hokey pokey and turn yourself about.
And that's what it's all about.
And that is what it's all about, Ian.
Yeah,
That is
right.
what it's all about.
That's
So,
right.
but no, I think that every time we have an opportunity to do those sorts of things, it calls us into a different. It just calls us into a new opportunity, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. And I believe that the sorts of conversations that we're having today around trying to find ways to be missional, to be mindful, to join God in the work that God is already doing in the neighborhood, right? So the way that Roxburgh writes about it, that says, our invitation really needs to change, right? Instead of asking the question, how do we fix the church and make it work again? We are being asked to ask, how do we go on a journey together, discerning what God is up to ahead of us in our neighborhoods in order to join with God there? And that's a very different perspective. And he says, don't be surprised when you hit roadblocks along the way.
Of course. Yeah.
Because that's the change, right? And he says, everyone who's ever set out on a journey with God knows several things are bound to happen. First, you'll know that the new journey is exciting and energizing. Second, as Israel discovered once it crossed the Red Sea, the established habits, patterns, and values quickly resurface as we journey in untested territory, and he's called them defaults. And make no mistake, they're powerful, and we always want to go back to that.
Of course. Yeah.
And I think that really, in terms of some of the more powerful change that I've seen in the church over the last 20 years, the most effective and powerful stuff is when there's that hard work that needs to be done to get us past those defaults.
Yeah.
Because we keep falling back into our old patterns.
Right.
And so that requires some intentionality and some mindfulness about the fact that we're doing that. And then good, honest dialogue and theological reflection about how we might not continue to fall back to those old ways of being.
Yeah, and to be aware when we're doing that. Yeah,
Right.
Definitely.
So
Definitely. Okay, well, we're just about running out of time, so
yeah,
good conversation, gentlemen.
I think so.
Thank
yeah.
you. Thank you.
What's happening at your place right now? Anything exciting?
At the parish?
Yeah.
What are we doing? We've got we're getting ready to do a couple of events in and around the community that build community.
Nice.
Around Valentine's Day and coming up in Lent, getting together for some book studies and reflection and things like that we want to do together. One of the things we're doing as a community, we have an evangelism team that's just kind of got together to start having discussions amongst ourselves as to it's a lot of what we've been talking about today is to teach ourselves and talk to each other about how we can be intentional about inviting.
Yes.
And because I think the best thing that we did as a community was say, we're not good at this.
Right.
To
that church, right. In Washington that said, you know, we're a group of people trying and making mistakes.
Right, exactly. And so we said, well, why don't we talk about learning how to do it?
Yeah.
And so we're very hopeful that a lot will come out of that, and already has.
That's
a little
cool,
bit.
man.
So we're looking forward to that, and you got the banquet coming up. I know
we got the dinner coming up, and this
things.
weekend we've got our every Anglican's got to have one. Another insider word. Wait for it, ladies and gentlemen. This Sunday at St. Aidan's Church, we have a vestry meeting. Hiss. I'd like to make a motion. Is there a seconder for that motion?
Is there a seconder?
Yeah, this is the
Point
Sunday
of order.
when we celebrate St. Robert Rule of Order.
Oh yes,
And,
yes, a great saint of the
yes,
church.
yeah, and
we're gonna love it.
mean, if you weren't an insider before this, you will always be an insider after a vestry.
I want Iain to come, and when someone calls point of order, I want you to yell ham sandwich.
Ham sandwich.
Do it.
Ham
Throw them all
sandwich.
off, Iain.
Yeah,
Throw them all off.
What is he talking about? That's
right.
a ham sandwich. And so we've got that, and that's been our focus right now, but we've got, we'll move towards that and some exciting things through Lent and so on when it'll be here before we know it. And Iain, you're done your exams, and presumably you're back in full swing now?
Yeah, actually, during this podcast, I got a text from my brother that there's a letter waiting on my bed. So I'm excited to go home.
Who's the letter from?
Holy smokes.
Well, it's from Fanshawe.
Okay,
So
all right.
We'll just waiting to see.
All right.
Well, this
Well,
is
the
another
next
teaser for
podcast,
next week.
we got
Yeah.
Najwa
Woohoo.
Zebian, and the result, whatever's inside of that envelope,
We will either have a happy Iain
or a
crushed Iain.
crying, crushed, broken man.
Who you're going to be asking questions
Yeah.
to.
So
right.
don't forget,
That's right.
AIA, ask Iain
Ask Iain anything.
And it can be a question to Iain, or if you want Iain to tease us, you can ask him to tease us, but
Sure.
email them off to vicarscrossing@gmail.com.
Yep.
Tweet us at Vicars Crossing, Facebook us at Vicars Crossing, and we'll get those questions on our next podcast, and we'll share those.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for dropping by once again. This is Rob and Kevin and Iain from Crossings Pub and Eatery on Hyde Park Road in London. We look forward to chatting with you again real soon. And remember to always look both ways, Kevin.
Before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Iain, with original artwork done by Catherine Olenek. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vicars Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vicars Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks.